Hey, welcome back. We have had quite the busy couple of weeks getting caught up. I appreciate everybody's efforts in getting their work to me last week and this week, and it looks like we're all in really good shape. So I'm going to dial this term down a little bit, make it a little slower so that we can finish getting caught up. And so we're going to do another combined journal today or this week rather. And the reading I'm going to do today is out of First Kings. And it's going to be, our journal is going to be about King Ahab and Jezebel. And my experience with Bible classes the last few terms is that very few of you knew much about King Ahab and Jezebel, which I really didn't know a whole lot about them either until more recently, where I started studying them for this class. And something that really came out of this while I was preparing this is, obviously it wasn't my doing. I feel like the Lord led me to this story. And in previous Bible classes, I've been able to share some things that I feel like the Lord wanted me to share with you guys about Elijah. But since we are kind of pressed for time in this term, we're not going to study the whole story about Elijah. So, but I'm going to give you just a brief background on it, because I want you to know what kind of person that Jezebel was in this time period, so that you have an understanding of and a little background going into the actual story that we're going to study. So let's get started. The background is in 1 Kings 16, and it basically, in the Bible, in verse 29, it says that Ahab, King Ahab, is the son of Omri, and he became the king of Israel during the 38th year that Asa was king of Judah. So for those of you who know about the split between Israel and Judah, the two kingdoms, they were the 12 tribes that came out of that story that we did with Jacob and Leah and Rachel. Those 12 children, that the boys that they had, there was a daughter named Dinah, just so you know, but the other 12 boys became the 12 tribes of Israel in the Bible. And that's really what the Old Testament follows throughout, is the 12 tribes as they move about. And so they end up in the promised land after Moses frees them from enslavement in Egypt. We talked about that, right? You and I, we talked about what happens to people when they are enslaved for years, which over 400 years is a lot of generations of children enslaved. So, it's not surprising, is it, when we talked about the commandments that God gives them, that they needed some instruction. Like they'd been told what to do for a very long time, and they didn't have minds of their own, really. They were not operating in free will anymore, right? They were being ruled. They were being actually enslaved, which is even different than just being ruled, right? We know the difference. Thank you for those observations, by the way, on some of your journals about that very thing, like why you thought that we needed the 10 commandments, why God gave them to us, because many of you said that humans on their own would not, since the fall in Eden, that we aren't good at being responsible and knowing what we need to be doing, and so I thought that was intuitive, that you felt like, hey, God's giving us some basic instructions on how to love people, right? How to love Him and how to love people. And so that's really what those commandments are. The first 4 of them are how to love God properly, and the next 6 are how to love people. You can really sum that up, and we'll talk about that more the last lesson that we do in this class. But for now, just keep in mind, as we've moved through that story about Samson, he was a judge. So this was before the kingdoms were established. There were no kings yet, right? So Samson was a judge. He was the last judge. And then there started this, this book of Kings chronicles all these different kings that Israel put into place, right? They decided that they didn't want just to have God as their king, right? We talked about that. Like, God wanted to be our king. That's it. He didn't want us to look to men and to the world for our leadership and for our rule. And instead, pretty much all of us in every country have done that, right? We all have some kind of rule of law, some kind of governing body, whether it's communist, socialist, democratic republics, whatever those look like. They're all what we've chosen as people to govern our lives instead of turning to God and living freely. And that's really what he wanted for us. So that being said, so we've got this guy, right? His name's King Ahab. And every king, the Bible chronicles this in Kings. You can go look it up. It's kind of funny. Every single king gets worse and worse and worse. And this guy, now he's the worst of the worst. But every king that comes is the worst of the worst. So basically what God's saying is, you guys wanted a king because you wanted to look like other nations. You wanted to be like the people around you that had kings and pharaohs and whatever. But that's not how I wanted you to live. And now look, you can see the corruption and the crap that happens out of governments, right? We can see that in our own world today where we live. It's just our human condition is full of corruption. So we can't ever place people in power in positions of power and not expect or anticipate that something is going to be corrupt, right? So this was no different. This was a bad one. So Bible gives us these stories for a reason, and I think that's exactly what it was. And also, this is kind of a combined theme from Lot. So that's going to be your participation point question this week, and I'll put that in there. But this guy, and even it compares to Samson. I mean, he went and got a wife from the Philistines, right? They were the enemies of his people. And he went and got a wife from them when he knew better. His parents tried to tell him that was wrong. Same thing here. This guy goes and gets a wife. She's a princess from, it says, the daughter of King Ethbal of Sidon. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that. Sorry. But anyway, point is, she's a Phoenician princess, and she's not of his people. She doesn't have the same moral values that they do. She's not been walking with the God. She's actually a polytheist, which is a culture of people who are worshiping multiple gods. Now, you can see the problem with that, and it's, similarly to Lot camping out in the Jordan Valley and then, inching closer and closer to the cities until he finally is living in Sodom, where it's wicked. It's a wicked town and full of wicked people, and they weren't people that think like him. They weren't following God either. They were, I don't even know what they were following, because they were just doing whatever they pleased, right? Based on that story we read, and the things they were doing were terrible. So same thing is going on again. Now, this story is similar. King Ahab, you'd think he'd know better, right? You'd think he'd know better than to go marry this princess, but he does. And then on top of it, he's got a very weak disposition where she's concerned. He makes her an idol, and he doesn't really stand up as a king, and instead allows her to make decisions. And so that story about Elijah that I was talking about, that's in 1 Kings 16, really talks about Elijah the prophet being on the run. He's one of the only prophets of God left, and he's kind of on the run because his Queen Jezebel has ordered all of the prophets of God to be murdered. She is that vile of a person, okay? So she's horrible. And King Ahab is going along with it, which is shocking, I think, for what we know about this group of people who were following God all the time, right? And now look how far they've come, right? And so he's, I'd say, caught up, like we talked about. He gets caught up in her, caught up in the world, caught up in having things, and he just lets her do whatever. And actually, as we read the next story, it's not even just like he lets her do whatever. He runs to her to solve all of his problems. So he's sort of a weak man in that, and not a spiritual leader at all. And some of the students have asked me in the past, well, what about Jezebel? Is she held to these same moral standards that this people group, the 12 tribes of Israel, were held to? King Ahab being part of that, right? So the answer is yes, because he, as a man, a king, and a leader of this group of people, the Israelites, he is responsible for leading his family, leading her and leading his family, right? And so, yeah, I think she is, we do need to hold her accountable to the commandments that God gave them, because God is asking that of King Ahab, but King Ahab isn't following them either. And so, seems like a really good excuse or a really good reason to not follow him, right? You marry someone that's not part of your people, and then you're not obligated anymore. And that happens a lot. That actually happened to me. And that's one of the ways I can relate to this story is I married somebody that wasn't a Christian and didn't have the same belief systems I do. And so sometimes if you do that, you really challenge your own faith in doing so, because it's hard to stay faithful in your own spiritual walk when somebody is opposing it. It's one thing if they are just maybe don't want anything to do with it, but when they're actively opposing it, it's a problem. And so it did become a problem in my life. So that's just one area I can really relate to in this story. And I told you that I would always share with you how I can relate if you're sharing with me how you can relate. So, but that's not all the story. So that's just part of it. I wanted to share that piece of it real quick about what kind of woman we're dealing with here that he marries. But the story in 1 Kings 21 is the one that I want you to study, and it's Naboth's vineyard. And I'm going to just set it up as a reading assignment for you instead of reading it to you. And so I will put that in RenWeb as a read assignment for you. Read 1 Kings 21, and then I want you to do the journal. I'll work on that with you when we come back. So I will catch up with you in a few.